Welcome back to New York. The White House vaccine czar did a very good job of telling us how big the problem was, and an element of self-congratulation about actually how far they'd done. The next three guests, the challenge is going to be to get them to say what needs to be done, because they're all going to agree on the awfulness of the current situation. The issue is how to improve it. These are three of the world's most prominent experts in this. First of all, Dr. Akinwumi Adesina, the president of the African Development Bank Group, who joins us remotely. Dr. Akin, can you hear me first? Let's test the connection.
Yes, I was having difficulty hearing you, but I can hear you now. How are you, Richard? How are you,
I'm very well,
Cigars, Jim?
Right, well, Jim is Jim Yong, the former World Bank president and the partner and vice chairman of Global Infrastructure Partners. You are, sir, a global expert on infectious disease management from a public policy point of view. The right man at the right place at the World Bank during Ebola, and we'll find out what you think needs to be done. And Dr. Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, who is a health expert, a finance expert, a trade expert, and one of those people that we call in when we need something done. Ngozi, who's now the head of the Director General of the World Trade Organization. So let's start with you, Ngozi. It's very easy to say something must be done, but the disparity of the numbers we saw, 80% first vaccine or one dose, 20% in emerging markets, and that really doesn't tell the whole story for those countries that virtually have no vaccination. What needs to be done?
Let me talk about two things, in the short term and then quickly for the longer term. In the short term, we must get those countries that have an excess of vaccines. Some countries have acquired 2 or 3 times what they need for their population, to donate those vaccines to COVAX, the facility developed to help poor countries, so that they can send them to where they're needed. They should also swap places. Some of them have ordered vaccines and they are at the head of the queue. We need them to swap places with countries that are behind, poorer countries, so that they can get a chance to get the vaccines. That's short term. In the longer term, manufacturing. We have to decentralize manufacturing in the world. 80% of the world's vaccines exports are concentrated in 10 countries. So Africa has 17% of the world's population, less than 2% of manufacturing facilities. So we need to decentralize manufacturing and scale up production.
Jim? The ability to do that sounds wonderfully easy in principle. And in practice, it's difficult in terms of physicality, but policy-wise, it's impossible.
You know, Richard, the thing that I want to remind everyone of is that we had a similar problem when we thought about treating people in Africa who were living with HIV. And you know, it's forgotten, but in the early 2000s, everyone was saying it's impossible, it's too expensive, the intellectual property issues will kill us. But we solved those issues. We can solve them for the vaccines as well.
Straightforward, simple question for a straightforward answer. Are we about to make the same mistake?
Yes, we're about to make the same. We're hearing all the same arguments that we heard back in the early 2000s when we solved that problem. President George Bush was really important in helping us to solve that problem. Here's what we need to do, Richard. We need to scale up manufacture of the mRNA vaccines. And we can do it while also protecting intellectual property. And really, it will be a windfall for the extraordinary companies who made these vaccines. But if we don't do it and do it quickly, we're going to be in trouble, because every single person who's infected is a mutation machine, right? And if the mutations go in a direction where the method of virulence, the spike protein, somehow changes, we're back to square one.
Akin, one assumes that the people making decisions are not mendacious murderers. Therefore, if you assume that, why are we in danger of making the same mistake again? Why can we not solve this problem? Why is the African Development Bank not able to help do that?
Well, you know, first is, let me agree with both Ngozi and Jim on this issue. I think the key is we have to have, you know, local manufacturing in Africa for sure. If you take a look today, only 1%, okay, of the vaccine production is actually done in Africa, so it's very, very small. But you take a look at the population of Africa, very, very high. Now, the key to being able to do that is that, vaccines are not just things you take off the shelf, right? You need to build up your R&D capacity significantly. So African countries have to boost the R&D investments that they are making significantly. Second is that we have to boost skills. The issue is not just simply having relocalization of foreign multinational companies producing vaccines in Africa. It is how we actually ensure that African indigenous pharmaceutical companies can actually have access to the technology. So, in fact, IP is still important, but have the skills to be able to produce not just mRNA technology, but several others to deal with Africa's epidemiological disease profile. So, of course, for the bank, African Development Bank,
hang on.
expect.
I'm gonna jump in here. I'm jumping in here, Akin, because I feel a sort of natural frustration here, because I've heard this for the last 18 months. Each one of you has told me we need to do this, we need to do that, but you are the policymakers.
So Richard, I'm no longer a policymaker, but here's what I would say. One of the issues right now, we went through a time when multilateral institutions fundamentally were questioned, their value, their role, and right now, where is the coalition that will bring together leaders of the multilateral organizations, private sector leaders, governmental leaders? Where is the coalition that will say, look, this is an unprecedented challenge. We've never had to do something for 7 billion people in the world. We now need to come up with solutions that are quite different. I think there are a lot of options on the table, but we need leadership. First and foremost, I think we need leadership from the traditional leaders like the U.S. government.
Okay. Can I come in?
Yes. Never mind about it.
Just to add to yes, I'm in a position, at least where some policies can be made and action. And we are taking action. It's not just talk. At the WTO, we actually reached out to the manufacturers of these vaccines. And we said, how can we work with you? And they said, we need help with our supply chains. Supply chains for vaccines are very complicated, spread across multiple countries. So we are helping them in that way by making sure their supply chains flow. They can scale up output and increase production. So we're not just talking about it, we're doing it.
So where's the problem?
The problem, there are several things. One, of raw materials sometimes.
Right.
Yeah, you know that the raw materials for vaccines are also used for other drugs like cancer drugs and so on. So right now, we're experiencing some shortages. Two, we have export restrictions and prohibitions sometimes that stop supply chains from flowing. We've got to lift all of that so that manufacturers can get their hands on what they need.
But to be very specific, for the mRNA vaccines, it's the fat globules that are the most important. And there's only one company making that now. And part of the reason there's only one company is, in fact, because of intellectual property. Now, again, I want to say it's so important to protect intellectual property, so important to make sure that Moderna, Pfizer, the others who have developed these vaccines are continue to be able to sell. But that one issue of the fat globules, it comes down to things like that, Richard. How do we increase the number of manufacturers for that? SM102 is what it's called.
All right. Akin, why this fat globules or the supply chain? Everybody's got supply chain issues. I understand the good work you're doing, Ngozi. But why have we got into this appalling position where 80% of the developed world has had one vaccine and 20% less than, and if we're talking some countries, probably in single digits, low single digits, have none?
Well, there's several. First, let me say on what you said earlier in terms of what we're doing. The African Development Bank is going to be investing $3 billion in supporting African indigenous pharmaceutical companies to be able to produce vaccines. That's on one side. The other point is why we are in the situation that we are in today. First, it's because the developed countries did advanced market procurement to buy up literally all of the vaccines that you have in the world. And you also have, as Ngozi was saying, vaccine nationalism that actually precluded the export of vaccines to countries like it was shut down from India coming to Africa. But for me, the critical thing is that Africa cannot outsource its health any longer to the rest of the world. Jim is there. He led a lot of the work on the Ebola stuff. And it was the same thing. By the time that we had Ebola and HIV, by the time we had the antiretroviral drugs, we got millions of people that have died. So my position is that we've got to build Africa's indigenous manufacturing capacity. We've got to make sure that we put more financing for private sector being able to do that. And we also have to make sure that the advanced procurement system does not just simply favor, Richard, the multinational companies. We've got to have a market pull system that helps the local companies as well. This is very, very important for economies of scale, for those companies to be competitive.
I understand that, and Ngozi is unable to unfortunately hear what you're saying, but the arguments are well known in terms of the short term and the longer term issues. I do.
But on intellectual property, Richard, I just want to pick up on what Jim said. You know, it's at the WTO that the matter is being debated and discussed right now, and we have proponents, more than 100 countries, who are asking for a waiver of the IP, and there are other countries on the other side who feel that maybe this is not what is needed right now. What we are trying to do is bring them together. I'm very sure and positive that there's a compromise solution we can come to, whereby developing countries can have the technology transfer, the access they need to manufacture and to get vaccines, whilst also making sure we don't disincentivize research and innovation.
I understand the difficulty, you know, this idea of you don't want to disincentivize those companies, because let's face it, we are only blessed with the vaccines that we have, unless you're China where the state pays, but in the West we're only blessed with them because there is a capitalist market that basically paid for it and then will create a profit in the future. So I get that.
But the public sector also invested in vaccines, by the way. It's a public-private partnership for most of them. But private sector invested heavily, the public sector also did. And we've got organizations like CEPI, the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovation, that has put about 1.8 billion into these companies, Novavax, some in Moderna, AstraZeneca, to help.
Look at the HIV situation. The thing that we were saying was, if we stop the drive to innovate, then we're not going to have any new drugs for HIV. And if you look back over the last 20 years, we've continuously had new drugs for HIV because we've protected IP. So in other words, there's a way to do it. There's already an example of how you protect intellectual property, reward the innovators, but at the same time make vaccines available. And I agree with both Ngozi and Akin that you've got to set up more manufacturing facilities, because what have Africans learned? You cannot trust the promises of the rest of the world that Africa will get vaccines. That is one of the strong lessons of this pandemic.
Okay, so let's take the longer term, because in the short term, the answer is clearly export. I mean, it's going to take several years to build these manufacturing facilities, to do the necessary technology transfers, IP protections. But in the that's all the long term. In the short term, it's going to take export. But in the long term, who's going to pay, do you think, for the future development of manufacturing ability in developing countries? Where will the money come from?
Well, it will come from, Richard, several places. You've got Akin, who has been he's the president of the African Development Bank, and he's been doing a wonderful job in trying to support African countries with manufacturing. So partnering with the countries, IFC, the World Bank are putting in some money, but the private sector themselves need to invest, and governments are also bringing some money. So, Richard, it's a perfect place for a public-private partnership to get these vaccines manufactured in developing countries.
Leadership.
Yes, but there is on the African continent, the leaders are doing so well.
Can I come in there, Richard?
That Akin talked about.
Jump in.
Yeah, I wanted to say that just what Ngozi is saying, it's very, very correct. Take a look at what has happened now. A lot of the leaders are working on public-private partnerships to get relocalization of companies to Africa. So, for example, you have Johnson & Johnson in South Africa that is working with the Aspen Institute, Aspen and BioVac on that. Can you hear me, Richard?
I can hear you.
Can you hear me?
Carry on. I'm just trying to make sure Ngozi's earpiece is working. Pop that in there, dear. You carry on. Let me make sure you're
Okay, all right.
Carry on, Akim. You carry on talking.
Okay, All right, so what I was saying is that, you have a number of initiatives that are actually working. You have Johnson & Johnson in South Africa that are actually going to be producing about 400 million doses, which is fine. You have also in Rwanda, in Senegal, as well as in Tunisia, the Institute of Pasteur in those countries, where you have Pfizer, BioNTech, also setting up companies there. But these are okay for the now, because that's basically producing things on the continent by the multinational companies. But what is actually needed in the long term is long-term increase in expenditures for R&D in Africa. Building Africa's pharmaceutical departments of pharmacies, biomedical sciences, making sure, because you need economies of scale in production of manufacturing of vaccines, so that we can have regional hubs where these vaccines can be produced, and also dealing with the whole issue of quality control. You have to have infrastructure to deal with the whole issue of clinical trials and all of that. So infrastructure is important. The bank is investing in infrastructure, and we expect that Africa will probably need about another $23 billion of infrastructure investments to be able to get this done on the long term.
Jim, you're no longer in public office. You can be undiplomatic. We all, I love what Akin's saying in terms of you need this, we need that, we need this, we need the other, we need long-term this. So what's stopping it? Where is the money come? Is it the money? Is it the regulation? Is it the policymakers? Or, I suspect, a bit of all, along with a bit of incompetence, that because everybody's overburdened at the moment with COVID?
Well, I think we're catching up. But, at a time when there was just, I think we have to just say there was chaos in terms of the global response. In every single pandemic, as far as we've had multilateral organizations, the U.S. has led. The smallpox eradication, the only thing we've ever eradicated, 300 people from the United States Centers for Disease Control went to WHO to help run the effort. When you have something like that break apart, right, fundamental questioning of the international organizations, I think that sets you back, and that's why. That's part of the reason. Now, the other thing is this, though. Some members of the private sector have done really well, right? The Amazons of the world, the drug companies have made them, but the other in the private sector, airlines, for example, have done horribly. And so what would these companies do? What would they invest if we were to tell them that by building this capacity, we're going to prevent these things from happening in the future? I think they would, and that's partly where the money will come from. But you've got to have a conversation led by people like Akin and Ngozi that says it is in your interest to ensure that Africa has vaccines. It's never been more true. In HIV, it wasn't really all that true. It was just President Bush did it, right?
And we are seeing a perfect example of this. I referred to it earlier, where at the moment you have the US lifting travel restrictions. So I assume, Akin, you're vaccinated, Jim, you're vaccinated, I'm vaccinated. Oh, we can come to the United States. But the vast majority in the developing world can't get on a plane and go to Europe or until they're vaccinated, and they're not going to be able to. Final thoughts. I'm going to give, Akin, don't go too long. Final thought, please. The one thing you want to take away from, your message.
Well, basically, Africa cannot outsource its health security just simply to the goodness of others. Africa has to secure itself by having a first-rate, public healthcare defense system. That's on the pharmaceutical side. That's also on the vaccine side, and that's what we're working on at the African Development Bank. We expect to put in $3 billion into supporting this effort in the next few years. So that's my thought. We have to be able to secure ourselves. Just simply relying on others doesn't cut it with me.
That's a longer-term solution, Jim. We've got to solve it now.
First of all, listen to these leaders. Right? It's really important that we have these leaders like Akin and Ngozi running really important organizations. And the next step is, business leaders have to think, what would it be like if we went back to the pre-vaccine era and we were back in the situation? Well, it's possible, and the only solution long-term is make sure that we have a robust vaccine production mechanism that can continue to respond to whatever new vaccine comes our way. Listen to our leaders. They know the situation in Africa. Africa has done so well. and support them.
You can tell. My final thought from you. You can.
Yeah. Final thoughts.
Well, hang on. I'm going to ask a question for your final thought.
Okay.
Hang on. You're a fighter. You fought in Nigeria, in government. You fought left, right, and centre in your time. Is this the biggest fight you've done?
In a way, yes, because lives are involved. I feel very passionate about it. And in that regard, my final thought is vaccine nationalism doesn't pay. At the end of the day, Jim has said it, Akin said it, it comes back to haunt all of us. So we've got to realize the interdependence. We've got to let supply chains flow so that we can manufacture enough for the world. We've got to let technology be transferred so that those who can't manufacture can also manufacture and scale up. So we can't be selfish in this pandemic. Lives are at stake.
But we are.
Well, we shouldn't be, because we will die in our selfishness if we don't change it.
You have a role to play, because you have to educate the business world that caring about things like vaccines in the world is directly related to their bottom line in the short, medium, and long term. If the business leaders come together and understand that, then they can play a critical role, because investing in an mRNA manufacturing facility in Africa, in my mind, is a no-brainer. It's going to be profitable because this is not going away.
Now we must leave it. Team, thank you for joining us. Sir, thank you for joining us. You can see the scale of the problem, can't you? We've brought you both sides now. You've heard the White House, you've heard the policymakers. You're getting an idea now of why the cry, something must be done. Not that straightforward, but they do it, but something must be done. Jane, back to you.